This is the Building Automation Monthly Podcast with Phil Zito, episode 144. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 144 of the Building Automation Monthly Podcast. And in this episode, we are going to be discussing the topic of APIs, otherwise known as Application Programming Interfaces. And if I sound a little bit out of breath, it's because I literally just walked in the door from the gym. Was a crazy workout this morning, and I'm a little out of breath, so forgive me for that. However, that is not going to affect the quality of this podcast episode and the importance of this podcast episode. Now, to be straightforward with you, a lot of you are not working with APIs right now. You hear about APIs, you hear about them in marketing, you hear about folks talking about, hey, our system has an open API, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is most of us in the BAS industry are still using straight up protocol interfaces, BACnet IP, LAN FT10, LAN EI852, et cetera, et cetera. So why is understanding what APIs are important? Or why is understanding what APIs are important? Well, because APIs are what a lot of building automation systems are starting to use in order to share data. As we move closer and closer to a common data model, which I'll talk through what that means a little bit later in this episode, we're getting to the point where we can actually start utilizing APIs. So APIs, as I mentioned, are application programming interfaces. So if you think about what that means is your building automation system or any other system in general, whether it be a lighting system, a weather station, etc., is an application. It is running some form of software. And in order for you to interact with this software, in order for you to get data to it, in order for you to send data to it, often known as posting, in order for you to go and create new data in an application, often known as put. And why I'm using these specific words that seem unfamiliar to you will make sense in just a couple minutes. And deleting data from an application, also known as delete. Those are all programmatic functions. You see, what happens is inside an application, you have snippets of functionality called functions. And these functions run specific, surprise, surprise functions. It's like, could I think of a better word? Well, no, because that's what they're doing. They're functions that perform a function or an action or a task. So within this application, you have programming that performs a specific function. So for example, if you ever go to weatherunderground.com and you go and you look at their API documentation, you'll notice that when they go and get weather data from a weather station, they are running a get function. Okay, so within the weather application, they are running a function called get, and that gets data for that specific weather station, and that data is sent in the form of a response. Now, how does all this happen? Well, it happens through what is called an interface, hence the API. So you've got an application. Inside the application, you have programming, and that programming is accessed via an interface. The most common interface in which an API is utilized is the HTTP protocol. So what will happen if I were to go right now, so I'm just going to type this in here, Weather Underground API. It's one of my favorite APIs because they have really good documentation and some nice examples. So if I go here to API and I'm reading this URI or URL is what you're probably more familiar with, which is Uniform Resource Locator. So I'm reading and it says, and you'll just have to visualize this because there's no other way for me to describe this. But it says http://API.weatherunderground.com/API / your key, which is how a lot of APIs work. They assign you a key and then you share that key or you utilize that key in order to execute a query. The query that we're executing in this case is conditions And we're executing it specifically to in this example that they're showing for California, city of San Francisco, and asking for a JSON response format. Now, I know for a lot of you listening to this, that's probably Greek. You're like, okay, what the heck did Phil just say? That's what we're going to break out and we're going to dive through in this episode. And then we're going to go through some examples of how we do this in a building automation system. So then, and I'll link to this webpage that I'm referencing right here. So then if I click on this show response, it shows my response in JSON format, which that's JavaScript object notation. So basically, if you're familiar with Haystack at all, if you've heard of that, you've heard folks talking about how we need a common data model. Well, Haystack is a form of data model. It's one that the industry seems to be coalescing around. And it's basically a key value data model, meaning that there's a key, for example, title being one of the keys, and the value is weather underground. I'm reading these key values out of this response from this API query, if you're wondering where this is coming from. For example, city, and then there's colon, San Francisco, state, colon, California, state name, colon, California, country, colon, US. You see? Key value. So what's happening here, and the reason I'm spending so much time on this is so that you really understand what's happening, because I find that if you really understand what is happening behind the scenes, if you understand what an API is and what is going on, then it's going to make it so much easier for you to work with an API. So we know there's this weather station program, and it's running on a server most likely, or a set of servers. And then we know that there are programs that we can execute, also known as queries. For example, we can query the conditions for a certain area. So we have a query or an action or a program or a function, whatever you want to call it, and that is conditions. And that function accepts a set of parameters. In this case, the parameters are the state and the city. And then we can set which format we want the response data to come to us, because we send over our query and the server sends back a response. You recall from earlier episodes, we've talked about client server. We've talked about how servers work, how you have a server and you have a client, and the client makes a request and then the server responds with a response. Well, that's all that's happening with APIs. It's simply a server and response. It's just a little bit different in that you have to know what function you're calling. You have to know what parameters to put into that function, and you need to know how to format the response from that function. That's what trips up a lot of folks in BAS. You see, I've worked with a ton of APIs, weather station APIs, healthcare system APIs, transportation system APIs, lighting APIs, AV APIs. And I will tell you time and time again, as soon as you understand the API documentation, and you can usually do this through the use of a SDK. You've probably heard that term before too. That's a